And I think this is the problem in the first place, isn't it? Because we have estranged ourselves from nature so much. And only now we're seeing the damages that this is creating to our landscapes, to our agricultural systems, to our supply chains, to our resilience to climate risks. Only now we're seeing that maybe we should sit a bit closer with nature, but we're freaked out about it and what it would mean to us. So
welcome to the Green Urbanist, a podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello everyone, Ross here. We're back for an episode, this time with occasional co-host Giulia Mori. Welcome, Giulia.
hi Ross, thanks for having me on the podcast once again.
Yeah, no problem. Always great to have you. And love discussing just a big range of issues with you and getting your perspective. Today we're here to talk about urban rewilding. And do you want to introduce yourself a little bit for the people who are listening?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a health and well-being expert, supporting teams, improving comfort of people and the physical and mental health of people using the built environment. So all that I do is around building and public realm. And recently I got the opportunity to expand my knowledge and understanding of social value. So try to understand how to get communities more engaged and get them really to shape the way that they can influence the design of public realm, the infrastructure around them, and the type of buildings and services that they need and deserves as community to really try and improve the quality of life of people across the country.
Nice. Well, that sounds very relevant to what we're going to talk about today. And before we get into that discussion on urban rewilding, just to, flag up for people in case you missed the last episode of this podcast, which was titled all caps announcement towards a regenerative podcast. Go have a listen to that. Basically, I just want to remind everyone here, in case you didn't know, that the Green Urbanist podcast is now accepting donations from listeners to support the podcast running, to help us cover its costs and invest in it so it can grow into the future. But as well as that, 50% of all the income from listener donations will go towards partner organizations that are funding climate action in cities. So right now, our first partner organization is Trees for Cities, who, as the name suggests, plant trees in cities and work with communities and do lots of really nice things around, community planting days and stuff like that. And I've volunteered with them in the past, and they're a brilliant, really good organization. So yeah, if you are interested in supporting the Green Urbanist and really good organizations that are doing climate action in cities, subscribe via Substack or via my website, greenurbanistpod.com/support. Those links are in the podcast description. But just to say, the podcast will always remain open and free, and there'll still be lots of great, all this great content basically still available for everyone. So if you can't afford to sign up or make a donation, don't worry, you'll still get access to everything. But you can support the podcast by maybe sharing it on social media or sharing an episode with a friend or a colleague. Okay, into the topic of today. So Giulia, you're hosting me today.
Yes.
In a sense. But I'm actually going to turn that around immediately. And I really want to ask you, when you hear the word rewilding, like what immediately comes to mind for you?
This is a very good question. I guess, so I was born, I grew up in a city. So I am a city girl. I always say this. I love being in nature, but I'm a very allergic person. So I think that speaks a lot of me growing up in a city. And I think for me, rewilding is to try and use those spaces that are normal in a city, parks, those little pockets of greens, create them when they don't exist and improve them where they exist, so that they're not just sterile places with just grass, just green grass. Green grass, I think, is not enough for us anymore. They should be a bit more active from a natural perspective. So having trees and maybe having some ponds, having water, but also I think having the stewardship of the community around it to protect them. So I think they can only really happen and be successful if the community is aware of them and supports them thriving. So basically not being untouched, even if they are part of, let's say, a relatively urban environment.
Okay, thank you for that. That was like surprisingly detailed. I always think like most people, I just assume they think like, oh, it's about like releasing wolves, or. But you obviously, I mean, bearing in mind that we have discussed this before, but you obviously have a much more nuanced appreciation of it.
I did think about wolves, if I'm honest. And actually, Italy, where I'm from, I think the number of wolves has skyrocketed in the last decades. I don't think they were ever reintroduced. They've always been around. But obviously there have been protections around wolves, and now they're reaching the cities. So I think maybe in this discussion today we can also touch upon the how when we reintroduce nature, the nature becomes very close to us once again, and we're not used to it anymore. So I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts around that. Brilliant.
Yes, we will definitely talk about that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about rewilding. So the backstory to this is that during my master's degree, I in my last module that I've just done, I did a 2,500 word essay on urban rewilding, and I read about 40 papers about it. And so it's sort of all fresh in my mind, and I feel like I have a lot of stuff I just want to sort of get out into the podcast and share with people because I think it will be useful. So I set about researching this question of urban rewilding. So like, what does that mean? What does it look like? Are people doing it? What I found initially is that it's a very new thing, urban rewilding or rewilding in urban areas. And there really isn't that much like peer-reviewed literature on it. So what I've done is I've gone backwards a little bit, and I've just started to look at rewilding in general. So as an overall approach. And then from there, I've sort of zoomed into cities and started to think about, okay, how can you apply that approach to an urban area? And that sort of got me a bit further. So maybe if we start there, and this idea of like, what is rewilding, even if you were doing it in a rural area or in a place that has like, doesn't have any people in it or has very few people. And this idea of rewilding as we know it really started about 30 years ago, like in the 90s. With this idea of the 3 C's. So it was carnivores, cores, and corridors. And there was this idea, really coming from North America, that we need to reintroduce the keystone species, which were carnivores, which were missing in many habitats. That's like the wolves, bears, coyotes, that kind of thing, which had been eradicated or greatly reduced in particular wilderness areas. Bring those back into core wilderness areas and then connect those cores by ecological corridors. So it's carnivores, cores, and corridors. And that has been done. So a famous example of that is reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone National Park or Yosemite. I always mix up which one it is. One of the national parks in the US. And that was a really successful rewilding initiative. Loads of information online about that. Really, really good case study. Where it's gone from there is basically, and particularly when you start trying to adapt those ideas to places like Europe or Britain, where we're much more densely populated, you basically, it's incredibly difficult to reintroduce wolves or wildcats or that kind of thing where there's a high population density, because it's not impossible, and I think we might get there eventually, but it's just not politically very feasible, and people don't tend, there's a lot of fear like that kind of thing around it. So we don't have those sort of big wilderness areas in Europe like they might do in North America. So the concept of rewilding started to become more nuanced and more based on process. So if you look at some of the really good peer-reviewed articles about rewilding now, they very much focus on rewilding is about restoring ecological processes and human management stepping back. And so there's this idea that there's a sort of continuum of wildness. So if you imagine, and I'll put a picture of this on the Substack blog for this episode, but basically on the left-hand side, you have like a totally degraded landscape with like very little ecological value, and that's like highly disturbed. So this is like, city centers or really intensively farmed areas or like bomb sites or something where like all the ecology is like very limited.
Yeah, I was gonna say there. Often when we think of degraded land, we don't think about agricultural land because it's often green or it has blossomed, etc. So it looks natural, and there is an element of nature there because obviously we're growing plants, but still is not wild.
Yeah.
So there's nothing else living there but what we're growing and maybe some weeds.
Yeah, like there's been many studies that show that often within cities, actually, there is often more biodiversity than there is in farmland adjoining cities. And it's because they're so monocultural, intensive farmland. There are like wildlife friendly farming practices. That's a whole other episode, I think. But so you think of like the left-hand side of that continuum is that sort of thing, like highly degraded. The right-hand side is pristine wilderness. So that's places like, the deep of the Amazon jungle, or like, up in the Arctic Circle where there's either very little human influence or the humans that are there are like indigenous people who have been, living there sustainably for thousands of years. And so it hasn't been degraded. So that's almost like the goal you want to get to, is that like super pristine, all the ecological functions working, all the, trophic levels of animals are intact. You've got predators all the way down to like the right bacteria and all that kind of stuff. Now that's a big, if you think about a lot of the land that we, in the sort of Western world manage is the highly degraded stuff. Getting it all the way over to pristine wilderness is frankly is going to be almost impossible, for many reasons. And so the idea behind rewilding, it isn't that you have to recreate pristine wilderness, but it's just about moving landscapes back towards, along that continuum, towards a wilder state. So it's about wildness, not wilderness. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it.
And can you just explain the difference between the two? Because obviously they sound quite similar, but I know that they are associated to two very different concepts.
Yeah. So I think for me, it's like wilderness is the noun, and it's like the ultimate state of, it's the most wild state. Wildness is like an adjective. So it's you can say something is more or less wild. And so, making something more wild than, we'll say, that agricultural field that we were talking about, it might mean just not using pesticides, or it might mean replanting hedgerows or using mixed crops. And just doing that, even though it's still very managed, you're pushing it slightly back on that continuum towards wilderness. It's becoming more wild. And particularly for urban areas, I think that's a really important distinction, because you're never going to get pristine wilderness within a city, but you can definitely get more wildness or less wildness.
So is it fair to say that we should strive for wilderness within the boundaries that we're given? So it's, as you're saying, it's obvious that we can't recreate a pristine jungle in the middle of a city, but we should try our best to go towards that as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that is definitely the goal of like contemporary rewilding practice. And the way they do that is there's sort of three ecological processes that we want to be reinstating. And those have very technical names, and I'm going to read out how they're written in the academic paper here. And then I'll give you like a more plain English version of it, basically.
I think this is Latin alert.
No, there's no Latin.
Okay.
But there is just like opaque language here. So the article is like a landmark paper. It's Perino et al. 2019. I'll put a full bibliography of everything, maybe not in the episode description, but definitely on the Substack, so you can see everything that's referenced. This one's really good. And basically what Perino et al. Say is that when you're rewilding, what you need to be doing, or what you want to be doing, is restoring three ecological processes. These are called trophic complexity, stochastic disturbance, and dispersal. Okay, so maybe the easiest one to understand is dispersal. And that is basically the movement of animals or seeds or different kinds of species through a landscape. And so, for instance, if you build a highway in the middle of a forest, now animals have a lot of trouble dispersing across that highway.
Okay.
So so that's the way like human activity can can disrupt that dispersal. And so one thing that a rewilding initiative might do is to build wildlife bridges, something like that.
Yeah. And basically what we're saying here is that if you take a dandelion and you blow on it,
yes,
and it lands on concrete, it won't make any more flowers.
Exactly. So that's the urban element of it, is like having so much hard surfacing and not having soil means you just obviously can't have dispersal like that. Very good example. The other thing, though, is that a lot of seeds are dispersed by animals, like in their poop, or birds or squirrels, basically picking them up and burying them, and that kind of thing, and then forgetting about them, and then they grow into a tree. And so if you don't have the animals to do that, those particular plants that rely on the animals can't disperse. So that gets us to another one, which is another process, which is trophic complexity. Now, all this means is, if you imagine the sort of a food web or a food pyramid from your secondary school ecology or biology days, I'm sure you all had this at some point, and it's this idea that at the bottom of the pyramid or the bottom of the food web, you have you have like bacteria, but you have plants. Plants provide the basic food for the next trophic level, which is like herbivores. They provide the next food for the next trophic level, which is like medium-sized predators. And then the next top is like the apex predator, like the wolf or the eagle or whatever.
Or the humans.
And sometimes even humans, exactly. Sometimes we're in the middle there somewhere. Not always the apex. And so basically, for a functional ecosystem to work, it has to have all those levels intact. Now, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of keystone species, a lot of apex predators are locally extinct. So that means we're missing the top of that food pyramid, but we're also missing a lot of just other large animals. So like within Britain and Europe, there are lots of, there's like bison. So there's European bison that should be roaming around the grasslands of Europe and Britain. There's different types of sort of horses and ponies and boar, wild pigs. There's a whole range of those sort of large mammals that aren't necessarily predators, that are important for different ecosystem functions, and they're just missing because we hunt them to extinction, basically, or we replace them with just normal cows and sheep.
Exactly. I was going to say all we're left is cattle,
Yeah.
so cows, sheep, and deers.
Yeah.
So in Britain and mostly in Scotland, there is issues with deers that are too many, and basically because they're not hunted by an apex predator, except for men hunters.
Yeah.
They eat saplings, so trees don't grow as much as they should in Scotland.
Exactly. So that's a great example of like, once the trophic complexity of an ecosystem is lost, it starts to degrade because the whole system gets thrown out of balance. The last ecosystem process... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, just to give an idea of what we mean for degraded landscape, it means that because there aren't those trees, then we can only have, prairies and grass growing, and that degrades in terms of water as well. So we don't have big water streams anymore. That would happen better if we had bigger trees. Is that right? Yeah,
George Monbiot did this like viral TED talk a couple of years ago about the reintroduction of wolves to that national park in the US, and it's fantastic. Like, if you haven't seen it, definitely go and check it out. And he basically says that like the reintroduction of wolves changed the course of the rivers, and it's because the effects of that filtered all the way down through all those trophic levels, because there weren't wolves there before. The deer basically weren't scared of anything, so they would just eat grass and saplings. Well, actually, deers don't eat grass. They do eat saplings. They eat the
baby trees,
the leaves of trees. Exactly. So they would just eat everything in one area, and then once that food source had run out, they just move on to another area. What happens when they reintroduce the wolves? The deers now lived in a landscape of fear, which is literally the ecological term for it. Literally, like prey animals live in a landscape of fear when there's predators nearby. And basically that means that whenever they spot a wolf, they all move on, even if they haven't finished the food source in that area. And then what happened, because they were moving on, it allowed the the vegetation, the natural vegetation along the river course to regenerate naturally because it wasn't constantly being eaten by the deer. And then that had sort of made structural changes to the rivers, and actually the course of the rivers ended up shifting back towards what would have been sort of their natural state.
Healthier state.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And it's sort of beyond human comprehension. And this is one of the key things about rewilding, is that a lot of the time it's just about letting go of control and not thinking that we have to design the final state. Sometimes you can't even predict what the final state of the ecosystem will be. You just have to think about what's missing, put it back in, and then monitor and see what happens and make changes if you need to, you know.
So basically spot the gaps into the equation.
Yeah.
And then let it do its thing.
Yeah, and to do that, often ecologists will use reference landscapes. So they'll say, oh, there's a pristine ecosystem, 30 miles away. Let's see how that works. And then we'll find the missing elements and put them into this degraded landscape. Or if there's literally no pristine landscape left, they'll use historical ones. And there's even a school of rewilding that says we should be looking at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago. And whatever was there, that's what we should be recreating, including basically woolly mammoths.
Okay. I think here we're getting to clonation.
Cloning.
Yeah.
Or bringing in modern elephants, translocating them into areas where you would have had a woolly mammoth because they sort of had similar behavior.
I'm not sure elephants would be very happy to live in Scotland.
No, we're not. Yeah, exactly.
But I get the gist of it.
Yeah. So that's another interesting part of rewilding is if literally the animal you need for this ecosystem is extinct, sometimes you have to bring in one that is just as close as we have, So that could be, I'll try and think of an example, but
bison.
Yeah, or if you can't get a bison, you put in some sort of different sort of breed of cattle that's hardier.
Okay.
So some rewilding strategies in Britain, they bring in sort of tough, semi-domesticated cattle breeds. Like
belted cows.
Yeah, is that one? Yeah.
I think, yes, because they have a different color belly.
Yeah.
And back and look like they're wearing a fashion belt. And apparently they can sleep outside for the whole winter, so you don't need to shelter them because
they're hardy.
Exactly.
They're tough. Exactly. So that's the kind of thing you can do. So that's substitutions for species, basically, is something you can do.
Understood.
Now, the last of those ecological principles, so we talked about dispersal, we talked about trophic complexity. The last one is this thing called stochastic disturbance. And it's this really interesting thing, actually. I think this is something that many people might find surprising, but it's this thing that natural ecosystems, natural landscapes require disturbance. But they don't like to be disturbed constantly and in the same way. So as humans, when we manage landscapes, we tend to disturb them always in the same way. So we'll always plow a field the same time, of the year, or we'll always spray pesticide, or we have very sort of rhythmic ways of disrupting landscapes, which ends up degrading them. In nature, disturbance tends to happen in a stochastic way, and stochastic means random. So basically, a tree falls in a storm, and that opens up light for a meadow to grow in its place and younger trees to grow up out of it. It's totally random, and it just happens when it happens. You can't plan it. Or other things are like with these big animals. So if you have a bison, they do really interesting behaviors with woodland, where they're really big, tough animals. They'll go through and they'll knock over trees and knock over saplings, and they'll rub their sides and their back on trees and that removes bark, and then that creates little microhabitats for other species. So they create all these little disturbances in a woodland that then other species have co-evolved with to take advantage of.
I'm also thinking about wildfires, because in places like North America, they have sequoias, and basically sequoia trees and this very big forest trees. They have seeds in the pine nuts, and the pine nuts only opens at very high temperatures, so that can only occur in the time of a wildfire, because you wouldn't set the woodland on fire on your own. And the wildfire allows the seeds to come out of the shell and also burns out the other trees that are not hardy enough to sustain the fire. So that creates a new fertile environment for the baby trees to grow.
Yeah.
And it unleashes them from the pine nuts.
Amazing.
So
Yeah.
that can only happen every few decades.
Yeah. Once you got a fire hot enough, and as you said, it just happens randomly whenever. But it is expected. It happens enough that the species evolved to take advantage of it. Awesome. So these three principles, these three processes, they're difficult to remember, and they don't really stick because they use this academic language. And a really good way of thinking about this is you can call them the 3Ds. So it's disturbance, diversity, and dispersal. So that's a much easier way of thinking of it, and hopefully is a way it'll help stick in people's minds. And the person who came up with this is a guy called Chris Dagorn, and I'm definitely saying his name wrong. I'm sorry, Chris. I presume it's French something? Dajourn, maybe? Dagorn. Anyway, Chris runs a really good website called howtorewild.co.uk, and he does really, really good and informative LinkedIn posts as well. And he's actually rewilding his own sort of land in Somerset. He's a really cool guy. I've had a few messages with him on LinkedIn, and he has this blog post where he talks about this scientific article, Perino et al., and he makes the point that in terms of communicating with the general public, we shouldn't be using this kind of language, and he proposes the 3Ds, and that's how he talks about it. So I'm picking up on that as well, because I think that's really useful.
Amazing. So just to bring us back to the conversation and the paper that you wrote recently, I think we talked quite a lot about what rewilding is, but what is rewilding when we apply it to the city scale, so urban rewilding, and what are the differences? And then maybe towards the end, I can ask you again, but how do we define success in urban rewilding and in rewilding?
Absolutely. Fantastic. When it comes to urban rewilding, I did a literature review, and there's no agreed definition for urban rewilding.
And I would even say that it's such a new concept that often the word doesn't exist in languages. So I think we're using rewilding mostly in Italian as well.
Yeah.
I don't think we came up with a term that is quite fitting yet.
Yeah.
So I think it's so new that it's a bit like IT equipment, computer stuff. So we're still using the English words.
Yeah.
I think soon enough we'll come up with Italian fitting words.
Yeah, and I'm interested to actually, I was reading an article. They were saying that in French they use the phrase re-sauvagement, which is like re-savagement.
Yeah,
and they were saying actually this is a bit problematic because that word has connotations of sort of racism against indigenous people.
It's the same in Italian.
Yeah,
risalvaggiamento might mean exactly that. So I think this is why even if it could exist as a term, is not as much used as it could be in this context.
Yeah, so language is tricky with these kind of things, and I think it speaks to the fact that we have cultural baggage with the term wild or wilderness.
Yes.
That we sort of need to get over and maybe be a bit more open-minded about it.
I just also think, and I think we're getting slightly linguistic here, but language evolves with history.
Yeah.
So why not having a new word that describes that?
Exactly. Okay, let's get into urban rewilding. It's only taken us 30 minutes to get here to the topic of the show. But I think all that backstory was important, and that all feeds into okay, we don't really have an agreed definition for what is urban rewilding, but it is happening in practice. And also the word is being used all over the place. So a lot of people say they're doing urban rewilding, and I think we need to be quite clear actually what we mean by it. So I've seen some articles or some organizations saying urban rewilding is anything that increases the biodiversity within cities. And I'm just thinking that's just lazy. Because then we're just talking about green infrastructure or urban greening. But urban rewilding is different because it's ultimately about ecological processes and a reduction in human management and allowing ecosystems to do their thing as much as is possible. So taking that, I would say we can think about urban rewilding in those terms. So really about anything that increases those 3Ds, the 3 ecological processes we talked about, and also reduces human management, ideally to minimal. You'll never have zero, because people will always want to use spaces, always want to be involved in spaces, and that comes with sort of safety issues and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think public health as well plays a big part of it, because for how much we want urban rewilding to be successful, we still don't want pests to be around in an urban environment that could cause diseases to the population. So I think there is a fine balance there.
Yeah.
On, for example, how do we manage rats?
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose we're dealing with by definition an unnatural environment, which is human settlement, towns and cities, and so a pure wilderness is probably impossible, but we can definitely move our landscapes much further along that continuum of wildness. So in terms of examples and what that might look like, there's basically 2 broad categories of rewilding: active and passive. And so to take passive first, passive rewilding is really about, as the name suggests, taking quite a passive approach, just leaving landscapes, let's say retracting human management and interference with landscapes, and just letting them play out as they will. And this has happened naturally. We have lots of examples of this within Europe, actually, of places that have been abandoned. And so within cities, that would be things like post-industrial sites. So where an industry has moved out, like a gasworks or any sort of, lead, or like some industry that we don't have anymore. Those sites have been, some of them abandoned for decades. And there's really good examples, particularly within Germany, where they have been allowed to regenerate through a natural process of succession until now they're basically like mature forest. And they're really, really like densely vegetated, biodiverse, quite naturalistic places. But they have like, rusting industrial infrastructure like littered among it. It's really interesting.
But I think you're talking about very big scale examples of, industrial citadel type of outlook. How could this look into the city? Like, is this something that can be done more centrally in the city using parks or not? Like, again, because if we bring in animals, even passively, do we even want them to be close to people?
Well, it's an interesting thing, because I think you can definitely do this at multiple scales. Some people would argue that like true rewilding has a minimum threshold, like 100 hectares or something, possibly arbitrary figure that says like it needs to be a certain size. But what I would argue is if you take the city as a whole, or like a whole neighborhood, you can start to create a sort of mosaic of rewilded spaces. And so a really good like micro example is like No Mow May. So for the month of May, a lot of grass areas within cities that are adopting this
in Britain,
in Britain, and I guess happens elsewhere as well, not sure, become in a sense kind of passively rewilded, because they're just allowed to grow in an unmanaged state. And what we're seeing in our local area here in East London is that you just have such an amazing abundance and diversity of plant species that are growing. Many of them, would be called weeds and maybe aren't very attractive to people. But there's also a lot of wildflowers. For the first time in the 6 years I've been living here, I've found loads of bluebells just naturally popping up this spring around East London on these sites that have been left unmanaged. So really on really small scales, you can start to get in that like extra diversity that wasn't there before, which is really good.
What do we mean for active rewilding, and how does that look like?
Yeah, so active rewilding is probably more what people think of when they think of rewilding, perhaps, which is about taking that active role and either doing landscape works to recreate a landscape that we think should be there. So that could involve tree planting or planting hedgerows or that kind of thing to sort of get the ecosystem, started. But also it often means reintroducing species that we think should be there. And there's some really interesting examples of this in cities. A fairly recent one over the last couple of years is Rewilding Enfield, which is Enfield is a borough in North London, so it's just on the northern edge of London, and they've taken. They basically were having a problem with flooding, so they have the River Lea that runs through. They're having problems with flooding with poor water quality, and they also wanted to boost biodiversity and get these other benefits that you might get from a wilder space. And so the council took a very big area of land, which was sort of recreational land, green spaces, and they've employed rewilding techniques, including releasing 2 beavers within an enclosed space around the river. But they've done that because beavers are natural engineers. They're ecosystem engineers. They are damming the river and they're reducing the rate of the flow, and they're creating a sort of wetland around that area, and they're reducing the flood risk downstream. So a really interesting example of using a rewilding technique for the purpose of actually reducing flood risk within a city.
Thank you, beavers. I think that's a great example. And I think, again, obviously when we talk about reintroducing beavers, creating a wetland, it's cascading, isn't it? Like biodiversity then is attracted to the wetland that wasn't there before because there wasn't space for it to be there. So plants grow out of the wetland, and then that attract bugs, and so on and so forth. Birds eat the bugs, etc.
Exactly.
So I think it's just a very positive loop of how to implement that change. And that is in a relatively urban area. Obviously, they had the space to allow the wetland to develop. So not everybody would be able to do that. Yeah. But still, I think, as you're saying, is a very good example of something that's worked. Yeah.
And it's whatever you can do with the space you have, because animals, particularly larger animals, will have a minimum range that they need to live, basically. So for wolves, it's dozens of square kilometers that they need. So obviously you can't stick them in a small space. Beavers, it will be smaller, but they still need a sort of natural minimum size to really thrive and to live properly.
I think it's also about the cost of this intervention compared to putting in place a man-made dam, right? Or flood barriers or drainage, etc. So I think it would be very interesting how far along in the future this climate change flood risk defense is gonna help the local area be resilient. Yeah. But definitely for now it's a very low cost type of intervention, I imagine.
In a sense, yeah. I mean, it's there's a lot of work that goes into
buying the land,
get the land, also capture the beavers. You have to have specialists, you have to have ecologists and biologists working on it, release them, and then you have to do a little bit of monitoring and that kind of thing as you go. So there is costs associated with it, but it's not the tens of millions of pounds that it costs to put in hard engineering flood defense. Yeah.
And I think, can we just talk a little bit about the benefits of it, because here we're talking about flood defense because a wetland is created, but again, going back to that point that we were making earlier about degraded land on agricultural soil and how that type of soil is not very good to drain rain, so the rain just slips over the surface of the soil, back into the ditch, back into the river, back into the sea. Yeah. So we're not really able to capture that water very well. So how can we capture the water for better resilience during drought? And also how can we avoid flooding when we have extreme rain events? Yeah. I mean, so much of sort of 20th century engineering for water was about getting water out of the city as quickly as possible into rivers and into the ocean. And I think what we're realizing actually is that if you can that's the sort of sustainable drainage arguments, if you can hold the water in place, then it relieves all this pressure on the drainage system. You also get the benefits of freshwater ecology. And it seems that when you take that plus a rewilding approach of bringing in missing species or trying to recreate missing habitats, you can sort of multiply those benefits. And what I'd add into that as well is just think about the educational benefits and the nature connection benefits for people who live locally. To young kids who are growing up in cities who aren't used to seeing wild animals, if they can go to their local park and actually get some binoculars or something and see some beavers just
doing naturally what beavers do, like what an amazing educational opportunity that is, and might inspire them to sort of take better care of the natural world.
I agree. I think if you are more exposed to nature, you're more prone to protect it.
Yeah.
Again, going back to the protection element, if you know the value that it has to you because it makes you happy when you breathe the air in nature, it's fresher.
Yeah.
It makes me very happy to see ducklings in the pond at this point of spring. So I think when you see that type of wonder in children and also adults, and that connection to nature, it's very important because again, it might help protect an habitat.
Yeah, I think it does, because there's a lot of good research actually behind this thing of nature connection is correlated with more sustainable lifestyles, more sustainable behaviors, and like pro-conservation values. And that has been shown in many scientific studies over the years. So that's like a very strong link. But to talk about another interesting one, actually to bring in something from the global south, because rewilding is happening, outside of North America and Europe. I know we've only really talked about those two examples so far. It'd be interesting to know how much information there is out there in like Spanish and Asian languages and non-English literature that is really rich, and that I and other like Anglophone researchers like know nothing about because it's not written in English. So that's like a separate problem of like the dominance of one language within the scientific community. But there's an interesting one in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. If you imagine Rio de Janeiro, obviously we're familiar with Brazil and the rainforest there and that like amazing biodiversity. So Rio de Janeiro is on the coast, and there's like a chunk of intact Atlantic rainforest, 8,300 hectares, quite a big piece of land, and it goes up into a big hill, and it's where the Christ Redeemer statue is in Rio de Janeiro. So that like iconic landmark. And on one side is the ocean, and then wrapped all around this national park is the urban area of Rio de Janeiro. So it's this remnant of Brazilian Atlantic rainforest that's been cut off from the rest of the rainforest, essentially, by the urban area. And so because of that, it's the landscape, although it still has, its sort of rainforest structure to the eye. And I suppose if we went there, we'd think, oh my God, this amazing, like natural piece of rainforest. But it's actually become degraded over the years because of it's been cut off from that wider area. There's been, they've lost a number of important species within that. And so recently, some scientists have brought back in 2 important species, and I'll include images of these if you don't know what they look like. One is a red-humped agouti, and the other is a brown howler monkey. So these are sort of, small to medium-sized mammals that live in the rainforest. Okay,
so one is a monkey, and the other one?
The agouti is it's a rodent. So it's like a big rodent, basically. So it's like a slightly stylish looking rat, to be honest, with a red bum.
Yeah, it has very long legs and no tail.
Yeah. It
looks a bit like a marmot.
Right, exactly. So exactly. Imagine like a tall, skinny marmot.
Okay,
basically.
so they brought back a monkey and a rodent that looks more or less like a marmot to wild.
Yeah, and part of the big reason why they did this was because of the dispersal element. So these are 2 animals which are very important for dispersing the seeds of particular trees by eating them, pooping them, basically. So since they've brought those back in, they're starting to see, some of those ecological processes kickstarting again. So that's another really nice case study.
Very interesting.
Maybe we can talk about some of the risks.
Yes,
rewilding.
And I think the risk should be divided in perceived risk and actual
risk. Yeah,
because obviously, at least in our Western culture, big predator mammals like the wolf, the bear, have a little bit of a stigma because they're stigmatized as aggressive animals that come and eat babies at night, basically.
Yeah.
And they do, and they come and eat the sheep at night. Yeah. And so often it's the fox. Fox often are associated with coming and eating chicken and hens.
Yeah.
So that kind of relatively aggressive apex predators.
Yeah.
So there are, I think rightfully so often, arguments against having those animals reintroduced, mostly, as you were saying, in a land that might be natural, but it's not as enclosed or as big as the American national parks. So the risk to the community is attacks from these wild animals that we are not used to co-live with anymore.
Yeah.
So I think the fear that you can't use a space anymore, I do feel that sometimes in Italy, where wolves are taking grounds more so than ever.
Yeah.
And maybe you won't feel safe anymore to go into the woods.
Yeah.
And end up like Little Red Riding Hood.
Exactly. Well, there you go. Like it's encoded in our like
fairy tales.
In our fairy tales and in our sort of folklore that like wolves are evil and should be avoided. Yeah. But this is where and it's like that thing is like, obviously we're not talking about reintroducing these into cities, but once they're reintroduced or they come back by themselves to the countryside, you can't stop them from coming into cities if they want to, which they do quite often. And this is where I think we can learn a lot from cities in the global south. For instance, Mumbai has a fairly sizable population of leopards, big ferocious cats that come in and out of the city. So actually several leopards who are known to sort of forage or to hunt within the actual city. And there is conflicts. There is cases of them killing usually children. And the way they've dealt with it, I think, is largely through sort of public awareness campaigns and an education of how you behave when there is known to be leopards in the area, or if you come in contact with one, and what you can do to sort of avoid a bad outcome from that interaction, essentially.
And do you think there are risks for those areas at the edge of the city that are in between the city and nature, where those animals are more likely to be, that could become degraded from a city point of view? So people might not want to live there anymore because they know that leopards might be there, they know that wolves might be there, because they're at the edge of the city. Probably the preys go and eat rubbish from the houses, and then the carnivore will follow the prey there eat the prey in the middle of the city. But if it doesn't find, say, a boar, it might just attack a child. So what is the implication of that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think there's sort of like two risks, almost like in terms of the socioeconomics of urban rewilding, which is one hand, I think the sort of either direction is bad. So one is that a place is sort of rewilding in this capacity, and then it gets a reputation for being dangerous, as you say, and that means the values in that area drop. It stops getting investment, it stops getting people living there, people are trying to leave and that kind of thing, and also people just become frustrated with rewilding. It loses its credibility, and people want to say like, stop, we're not doing this anymore. That's a real risk. I think the other side of it is also a risk, which is where you have a really successful rewilding intervention in a city. People really love it. You might get green gentrification, and you might have an area, let's say a low-income area, where you do a really good rewilding project. It becomes really biodiverse, becomes a really attractive place to be. People start traveling from far and wide to go and see what's happening in that area, to enjoy the nature that's there.
To go live there.
And then people start going to live there. All the property prices start going up. Great if you're a landlord or a developer, I guess. But if you're a renter, or if you're someone who runs a local business, you're getting priced out and you're pushed out to less biodiverse areas. Yeah. And that is the real risk.
Can we talk a little bit though about, again, natural balance and the space to nature? So if that ecosystem, so the apex predator and the big mammals that are part of the food chain were in an inverted comma remote area, relatively far away from cities, that would be fine, right? I think the attractiveness of the city for that wildlife is probably what makes it dangerous.
Yeah.
So if we didn't attract the preys into the city in the first place, because, for example, it was easy to rummage on rubbish, then the risk would be lower. Well, because we keep attracting animals into the city, then that attracts the risk.
Come from, yeah, and I think to be honest, you're always going to have those sort of risks unless you go for a full, what you might call like fortress conservation model. So, like for instance, which is basically where you create a sort of, you just put up fences around the wild areas and you keep the animals in there physically.
Sounds like Jurassic Park.
Yeah, exactly. It's a bit of Jurassic Park, and I think the risk of that is that you create pockets of sort of wilderness prisons, and then everywhere outside is just degraded. And I don't, and also with those sort of approaches, they tend to kick all the people out, even people who can successfully coexist, like indigenous people.
Yeah.
And that has been happening in Africa, where, you know, Maasai tribesmen who have lived there for generations are being removed by conservationists because they're deemed to be a threat to the biodiversity. It's like absolutely absurd when you think about it. But it's just this idea that like humans can't, like humans and biodiversity can't coexist. And we forget the fact that we're actually part of that biodiversity if we live in the right way.
Yeah. And there's also another part to it. Obviously, we might see that predators' numbers are growing up because there is a lot to prey on. But once they regulate the number of preys, the number of preys available will regulate the number of predators. So you can't, because you can't overpredate.
Yeah.
And then you're starved to death if you're a wolf and you've eaten all the boars in the area, or you've eaten all the deers.
Yeah.
So there is a balance, a natural balance, where you just will have less puppies because you just can't, they can't feed on the deers because we've eaten all the deers. So there is a bit of I think the balance has to be established, and that might take a few years to happen.
Yeah.
So maybe that is why we're seeing a lot of predators spreading now, and the numbers might be going down.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean there is like a I think like a famous graph from like an early ecological paper, which is like a seesaw graph. So it shows the number of foxes in an area and then the number of rabbits. And as the number of foxes grow, the population of rabbits drops. And then shortly afterwards, the population of foxes drops. And then it just goes up and down like that over time around a sort of central equilibrium. But you always have that sort of slight boom and bust of different populations. And so you're right, at some point you might have what seems like an infestation of a particular species. But it's that thing of like, we just have to like, if we let ecological processes play out and try and make sure it's in as natural a state as possible, then we should start to see it self-regulate. And to be honest, I think in terms of the fear of large predators, like that will only be an issue in very specific circumstances. So places like Mumbai, places like LA where they get urban coyotes, places like maybe, you know, places in Italy where you do have wolves, and also places like Rome where they had boar, you know, coming into the city and eating rubbish. Like it does happen, but I think the message should be that in reality, each of those situations, it will be specific and should have like a local specific response to that. And particularly in Britain, there's no appetite for releasing large predators within Britain. Even small predators like wildcats. Like what we were looking at pictures of wildcats the other day. They're basically large house cats. They're adorable. But once you say, what about releasing a couple of wildcats into the forest in Scotland? People are like, oh, they'll eat
my
me.
hens.
Yeah, exactly. They'll eat me when I'm out hiking. And you're like, it's just absolutely not going to happen. But, you know, it's a process to go through, I think, with people sort of getting them used to this idea of having more sort of interesting wildlife around.
Yeah.
We're so used to our landscapes being so degraded that the idea of having bison and wildcats and all these different types of animals that we're not used to seeing, but which by all rights should be here, it sort of freaks people out a little bit. And you know, there's an example of that in Kent. Kent Wildlife Trust done a great job of reintroducing European bison into a nature reserve that they have in Kent. But it seems to be going really well. However, within British law, they are, classified as dangerous wild animals. And so you can't just release them in the landscape. You have to put them in an enclosure. So they've had to build these really big fences, like metal fences, all the way around the nature reserve and basically keep humans out. So you can't even go in and get close to them. And so that to me is like, and they have said themselves, I watched a webinar with them, they said like, that's not an optimal outcome. Like they said, in reality, what we want is people and these animals coexisting in a way. And we know it's possible, but the law is so risk averse at the moment. You have to keep them totally like physically separated from human beings. So,
and I think this is the problem in the first place, isn't it? Because we have estranged ourselves from nature so much, and only now we're seeing the damages that this is creating to our landscapes, to our agricultural systems, to our supply chains, to our resilience to climate risks. Only now we're seeing that maybe we should sit a bit closer with nature, but we're freaked out about it and what it would mean to us. So I think for me, the definition of success would be to bring those community closer to understand and protect ecosystems better. Because yes, we do study that at school, maybe for like 3 months of our lives. And I remember the stochastic system and etc. from university and high school. Probably not many people even ever studied them.
Yeah.
So I think how do we talk to children about it? How do we raise awareness about it in the adult community and population is going to be key to how we unlock us making peace with nature. And I do agree that some of these animals that we talked about today are dangerous and they have hurt people.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see if those communities that have been affected would benefit from, again, a more succinct, more focused education around how you behave around the bear, how you behave around the wolf, where not to go. Maybe you shouldn't go in the forest in this season because it's breeding season. And the wolves might be a bit spooky because they just don't want you to go close to their cubs. Or the puppies, however they call it in English. And I would just understand that. If you know, as much as you know not to go in the woods during the hunting season in places like Italy and France, if you know as well when the animals could be a bit more dangerous, maybe we would all be a bit healthier and happier and safer.
Yeah, like people who are used to living around big animals know they have to adapt their behavior to them. So if you go hiking in British Columbia, there's grizzly bears.
In Canada.
And brown bears, which can be dangerous. But people who live there know that, first of all, they're not really interested in humans. They'll only attack if they feel threatened, or if they feel cornered. And so what people do is as they walk through the woods, they clap their hands or they shout occasionally to let the bear and other animals know that, hey, I'm a human, I'm nearby.
Yeah.
And the other thing is often people will bring a canister of bear spray, which is basically like a high-strength pepper spray. And that's like a last resort. If a bear is coming at you, you spray it with this. And it doesn't really hurt the bear or kill it, but it's very unpleasant. And they'll basically turn around and run away. So people adapt their behavior to make sure they can be safe. And it's the same thing if you lived near big cats. It would be a different a different sort of set of behaviors. So for instance, never run away from a big cat, because their predator instinct kicks in and they'll chase after you, and they are faster than you.
Yeah, they're definitely faster than me.
So there's all these kind of things that like we can learn these things again if we live in close proximity to these animals. And I think we can what I always say as well is like every day in cities people get killed in car accidents, in collisions, but nobody ever bans cars from cities. And so there's behaviors you take to minimize the possibility of you dying in a car incident, but we always accept a certain amount of risk that it might happen. We have to take the same approach with wild animals because they bring so many benefits to being with us, and we just need to do what we can to reduce that risk.
And just, I think, to bring one maybe last example, I love going to the sea. I trained as a lifeguard for the swimming pool, but still I love water sports, etc. And everybody that's ever gone to the sea knows that you shouldn't swim if the sea looks rough, if it's very windy, if the waves very high. And even if you swim on a day that looks very calm, you could get hurt by a jellyfish. So
they're the worst.
I mean, how do you control jellyfish? Or I mean, I'm not even gonna talk about Australia and having sharks very close to the shore, but you know what I mean. We are already co-living with that kind of wilderness on our holidays, and people don't die of jellyfish usually in the Meds. So I think we can try and take a leap of faith and try to be a bit better on how we behave around nature in cities.
Yeah, I think this has been a really good chat, and I'd like to just bring it full circle as we're sort of towards the end here and just talk about some maybe tactics for practitioners, like urban rewilding tactics. And I think we've talked a lot about species reintroductions and the thing co-living with animals. You don't even need to go that far, and actually most of the time you won't be allowed to go that far with urban rewilding. So if you're like an architect or a landscape architect, something you're thinking about, I'd like to make my landscapes a bit wilder, urban parks or new developments, that kind of thing. I think some things to think about are give up a bit of control around what the final outcome will be. There's a big thing about maintenance, particularly with new landscapes going with new developments, that you have to maintain high levels of maintenance in order to keep landscapes looking, as good as you want them to look. But that's only if you're designing unnatural landscapes. So if you're designing, green lawns that are cut to like 2 inches, and, street trees that need watering, all the time, that's, you're sort of setting yourself up for rewilding being an impossibility. So you need to sort of give up an element of control, but not everywhere, I would say, because people, there's associations with fully sort of landscapes that are just doing their own thing that look like they have no human input. They feel neglected or they feel unsafe. And so what you can do is set aside certain parts of parks or landscapes or developments for no or very little maintenance. Maybe just go once a year to chop everything back and then let it grow again. Some species need that. But then cut paths through, go out with your lawnmower and cut little patches so people can go have picnics, put up signage, explain to people what's going on, put up information boards that say, look out for these kind of butterflies, these kind of birds, that kind of thing. And I think that goes a long way of making people feel at ease of what's going on and bringing them into it and along with it. And I think what I should have said first before you even get to that point is really think about co-designing with the communities and bringing them along on that journey of why is a rewilding approach being considered here? What would they like out of that? How can they maximize the benefit of that while still doing the things they want to do? And I think this could be done in many places. Yeah,
I think maybe one last thing for me. I'm absolutely not an expert in this, but another important part of landscape is that they need to provide food all year round for biodiversity that is around there. So bees and other bugs are alive throughout the year, not just in spring and summer. Yeah. So how do we feed them and how do we feed birds during winter? I think it's a very interesting topic.
Yeah. And it's also that thing of saying when you think about that, your first thought might be, okay, I'm going to plant this plant that flowers in summer and this plant that bears fruit in winter and that kind of thing. But maybe a rewilding approach is just saying, okay, I'm just going to leave it and see what happens. And what generally will happen over time is that you'll get that sort of diversity naturally, because all those species have co-evolved together to come out at different times and take advantage of blooming at different times. And so nature knows better than the best landscape designer. Sorry to say, landscape architects. Nature will do this for you, but it usually happens over timescales that we're sort of uncomfortable with. So it might take years for you to get to that point where it's you're thinking this is like a maturing landscape that is really beautiful and is supporting lots of biodiversity. It might take you 5 years to get to that point or something, whereas you want it on day one,
Yeah, pioneer plants, which is what grows on a bare soil.
Yeah.
Pioneer plants are the first plants that grow on something that is uncovered. They can be very ugly looking, very spiky looking.
Yeah. Stinging,
thorny. They don't look like out of magazines,
Exactly.
landscape magazines. So maybe again, normalize ugly plants.
Yes, exactly.
But obviously, I know that a lot of landscape designers are very in close contact with nature, so they will only plant native species, etc., or species that even if they're not native can be resilient to hotter, drier climates. So there's absolutely a lot of great work being done out there.
Yeah, and that might be the bit where human management and interference is actually necessary, is where you find invasive species that are taking over. So like the Japanese knotweed, rhododendron, that kind of thing, which you might throw your ecosystem out of balance. That's when, if you identify that, go in and remove it. And I think that's quite an accepted thing within rewilding. But I would say, to add a bit of nuance to that, urban ecology is different to, we'll say, intact ecosystems. Within urban environments, there's different microclimates, there's different chemical makeups because of, we have all these different materials and types of metal around. And so often it will be exotic species that will thrive best in urban areas. And as long as they're not invasive and they're supporting biodiversity, I think leave them. That's fine. Accept them, I mean, for goodness sake, apple trees aren't native to Britain, but, what's more British than cider? So we do accept these things once we find they're useful and they live well here. So
that sounds great. So I think, just to close this out, allow indigenous knowledge and indigenous plants to, thrive in the land. Relinquish some control.
Yeah.
Let nature do its thing, and just be part of the community. So like co-design, co-think, co-use this space with the community, because they will be using it.
Yeah.
And if the space is not for the community won't make the best out of it.
Absolutely. You summarized that perfectly. And I guess as a final sign off for people, I'm going to try and interview some people who are doing this rewilding. I really want to talk to someone from Rewilding Enfield, and there's all these projects popping up. I'm going to try and get some people on to talk about real projects. So keep an ear out for that.
Amazing.
Thanks, Giulia, for joining me.
Thank you, Ross, for joining my podcast today.
The Green Urbanist with Giulia.